Oh, yeah. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Artists of Data Science Happy Hour. It is Friday, January 22nd. Super excited for all of you guys to be here. Hopefully, you got an opportunity to check out the new podcast that was released today. I did an episode with Dr. Christian Bush. We talked about his book, The Serendipity Mindset. That book is hands down like my favorite book of 2020. I absolutely loved that book and absolutely loved having an opportunity to speak with him. So I hope you guys get a chance to listen to that episode. Probably one of my favorite ones from this year. Other great interviews happened this week. I got a chance to interview somebody I tremendously look up to, James Altucher. So I got a chance to um, talk to him and interview him, and I'm excited to release that episode sometime in the near future. So room is filling up. We got a lot of good friends here. Thank you everybody for swinging by. We got Nicole back in the house. We got my good friend John Sebastian. Tom is in the building. We got a Winnipegger in the house. We got Mitul Patel. We got Tom, Monica, Giovanna, Koshal. Man, so many awesome people here today. How's it going, everybody?
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, super happy to have you guys here. So standard protocol, guys. If you guys got a question, first one to take the floor gets the floor. But while that person is asking their question, go ahead and just type in your question into the chat or just say that you have a question. I'll be sure to put you into the queue because I'll be monitoring the chat. So at this point, whoever wants to go with their question is more than welcome to. We got Wiko in the building too, man. Good to see you again, Christian, Eric.
Yo,
How you doing, man?
pretty good.
Right on. So,
Hello, everyone.
yeah, if anybody has a question, man, go for it.
Yeah.
I'm happy to open the floor. So go for
I'll
it.
take it.
I can go. Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, my question was just around doing hyperparameter optimization. Just a general, like when you're starting to do that, how do you kind of decide, I guess, how many parameters you maybe test at a time and how long, but because you don't want it to spend like 2 hours or all night running a model trying to optimize it. So do you just start small and then kind of pick things from there, or how do you maybe approach that, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I can't wait to hear everybody else's input on it. But personally, what I do is I'll start with some form of like interval bisection where I'll start maybe some small value of a particular parameter and then do a larger value of it and then pick something in the middle and then kind of hone in that way. But when I define my search space, I define my search space as a function of my input data set, because if I'm going to be arbitrary, I'd like to be arbitrary within reason, right? So for example, if I have some number of rows and some number of columns, maybe for a particular hyperparameter where it's reasonable, I would define my search space as maybe going from the log of the number of rows to, I don't know, the square root of the number of rows, right? So it's like a reasonable search space, but I mean, it's being arbitrary, but I have some intention behind my arbitrariness. But I'd love to hear how other people do this. Ben, how do you tune your hyperparameters?
I use Data Robot. Is that a lame plug?
No, dude, that's all
actually, to throw out some other competitors, I know there was like an auto glue on that MXNet pushed, or the Amazon team pushed from an Amazon employee. You've got H2O, so you have some open source projects where they've tried to take it on. And then is it Teapot? Teapot's the other one. Which is super exciting because you kind of bring this AI layer to the task of hyperparam search and tuning, because it's not just you have the dumb way to search. The dumb way to search is kind of the incremental, like, hey, I'm an idiot. And I'm not saying anyone's an idiot because everyone's done this. Like, hey, I'm an idiot. I'm just going to like incrementally search. But then you have some more sophisticated techniques where there's a little bit of intensification and diversification. That's what people talk about. So if you find something sweet, you should kind of oversample it. If you're not finding success, you should diversify. those are some of the open source available ones. But me selfishly, personally, I would just use DataRobot.
I'd love to hear, Tom, if you got any input on this. And then after Tom, we'll hear from Nicole.
So this relates back to my roots in multi-physical system modeling too. You basically doing a parameter sweep is the way I see it, although hyperparameter is a good term for it. But I like what Ben said, and I really liked what you said, Harpreet. It's a spirit of don't do it on some type of linear scale is my first big watch out for. Do it on something more like a log scale or a power scale. And this way you can automate it reasonably. You can start to look for, you can have it set so that if it found the last best one on an endpoint, the top one or the bottom one, and I'm just talking 3 points, then you know to keep going and just to shift your scale. But if it lands in the middle, you know you can stop searching on that particular parameter in that loop. However, the sad thing is once you have optimized one of the other parameters or you're going off again, you need to re-include that one. But if you just do something simple like a star search, you might know this by, and get it on something like a log scale, I think now you can begin to automate things and it makes it go better.
Thank you very much, Tom. Nicole, do you have any insight on this? And after Nicole, we'll go for John Sebastian and Mikiko on how to tune hyperparameters.
I posted a paper into the chat, and I'll post it again for those who are just joining. This basically describes how a researcher determined that you can use the initial outcomes of training as an input to determine like how to set then your hyperparameters. And it helps to identify whether the model is overfitting or underfitting, and then that suggests the optimal settings moving forward. So I won't spoil the paper. I'll let you guys hear it or read it rather from the source. But it's definitely a good one. And this researcher, Leslie Smith, has a lot of good work in the experimental space.
Right on. I know what I will be including in the newsletter next week. Thank you very much for that. I've got a bookmark and I'll check it out. John Sebastian, Mikiko, and then Dave Langer. How do you guys tune your hyperparameters? What's your methodology? How do you go about doing this?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to add up anything new because I would do pretty much the same approach as you described during your first intervention. So yes, this is pretty much like word for word what I would have done, what I usually do right from the beginning. So sorry, but no new inputs from me.
No problem. I mean, we're DSDJ camp, so we kind of tend to think alike. Mikiko, are you still here?
Hey, I am. I'm trying to figure out an appropriate Zoom background because I, had to reformat my entire Mac. So I'll have the video on in a little bit. Yeah, in terms of hyperparameter tuning, just a quick question: is this for a standalone project or is this for like in production?
Austin, what is this for?
This is just a standalone project. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. For standalone, like everything that everyone said is totally correct. When you do eventually, like, for example, move to sort of a production system, then it becomes less about like, how do you sort of like hand tune parameters and more like, how do you thoughtfully, first off, set up like logging and sort of notifications for when, model performance sort of degrades. And then also some of the packages that, like, for example, Ben mentioned, like Teapot, I've heard some really great stuff. And I think there is a move to like AutoML for at least like hyperparameter tuning. So, yeah.
And it'd be awesome if you can start implementing into your workflow some type of tool to help you track your experiments. So MLflow is a great one that I use. I used to do this by hand because I just didn't know about MLflow, and it has been a game changer and a lifesaver for me. Dave, how do you go about deciding what your search space is going to be for your algorithm?
Simple. I try not to do it if I don't have to. I tend to prefer algorithms. I mean, I've had to learn the hard way. I tend to prefer algorithms that don't require a ton of tuning. For example, I would prefer a random forest, if at all possible, to XGBoost, because XGBoost just has a much wider search space for finding the right collection of parameters. If I can get acceptable business performance out of a simpler algorithm like the random forest, why wouldn't you use it?
Thank you very much, Dave. So does anybody else have anything to add to this segment? Otherwise, I'll move on to a question from Anas.
I have a related question, and I got to confess, I don't even have a clue on this one. So it may be too deep here too, and that's okay. But hang on a minute. Will you turn that off for just a minute, noise-wise? Thanks. Let's say you're choosing between algorithms. So when I'm automating a pipeline, I'd consider several different models too. But then I'm thinking, am I gonna choose the model based on the default hyperparameters and then just take the best model and fine tune the hyperparameters? Or do I really need to try to fine tune the hyperparameters on each model to choose the best model? And I confess, if someone asked me on the show, I'd say, I don't know. I have that same question. So I'm just curious what others would say on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the experimentation part and the science part of all this. You kind of go with what I don't want to say what feels right, but you got to go with you got to go with some reasonable arbitrariness. But any other points on what Tom was saying there? All right.
Yeah, well, I guess if under the no free lunch theorem, you just never know, generally speaking, what model is going to be the most effective. I mean, you're probably not going to use a random forest for a high dimensional text problem. You're probably going to use an SVM or maybe a neural network. But generally speaking, you never know. The problem becomes how many algorithms are there out there that have reasonable defaults that'll give you reasonable performance? There's not actually that many. So it's kind of complicated. So generally speaking, that's why I always throw random forest in the mix, because it usually does pretty well, generally speaking, with the defaults. You can tune it a little bit, but you don't have to. And then maybe I throw an XGBoost in there. But if the XGBoost, I'm going to have to do some parameter tuning. And I've had some good success using randomization techniques. So you create a data grid of potential values, and then you randomly select from them in permutations and just kind of find something that works. That kind of shrinks the search space. It's not going to give you necessarily optimality, but that's something you can do. Unfortunately, once again, if you're going to look at 10 different models and 9 of them need non-trivial amounts of parameter tuning to find out which one's reasonably okay, it's a lot of work.
Random forest is definitely one of my favorites as well. So much so that soon I'll be launching some merch, and one of the shirt designs I have is a random forest shirt design. It's pretty minimalist, but I think it's a sweet design. So once that's up and ready for purchase, I'll let you guys know. So a question now, I guess we'll move on from this topic, and we'll go to the question from Anas, and I hope I'm saying your name right. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, cool. So while he's asking his question, I just want to say next up on the queue is going to be Mark, and then Carlos. Carlos has a question about blockchain. But if anybody else has questions, go ahead and just dump it right there in the chat. I'll make sure I add you to the queue. But the floor is all yours, my friend.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My question is about model deployment. So usually when you go to YouTube and everywhere, most of the tutorials are about Jupyter notebooks. And then I remember from the last session, a last meeting, I remember John was talking about, I had an interview, and they were like, this is not a production code. So I think my question would be, is it now an asset to be good at deployment? Or is it a required thing now as a machine learning or as a data scientist?
I mean, you can deploy something simple, right? You just get an AWS account, right? And then what you could do is set up a S3 bucket that then, when you drop something new in there, it kicks off a process that does an ETL process that then takes that transformed data, goes to some EC2 compute instance, model gets run on there, predictions get served, pushed back into a database, and then you've got like a miniature version of a deployed model in that sense, right? So it's not terribly difficult to do if you want to do something simple like that. Is it a good skill to have? Absolutely. But I'd love to hear what Ben has to say on this topic.
Well, I love where this has progressed. It's become so much easier. So pick your favorite AI library, and I don't think it's very hard to find a Flask wrapper or some API where people have just given you that code. It just works. But I think some of the things you hit on, the cloud is amazing. Like, I'm a big Amazon fan. They make this really easy. So like serverless lambdas, there's so many things out there. It used to be hard. That's the stuff that like the older people on this call can bring up. It used to be hard.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is a good skill to have, and I don't think it's as challenging to pick up now as it was maybe a while back. I'd love to hear from let's hear from Mikiko on this topic, and then after Mikiko, let's hear from anybody else who wants to talk about model deployment. You can just let me know in the chat, and I'll call on you.
Yeah. So the funny part is that we like, so in the startup that I'm working on, right? Like, we're very, very early stage, and we in some ways kind of are struggling like with the question of like, do we build versus buy, And so, and I think a couple of people have mentioned this before, like Dave Langer had a really great response about how like, yeah, Dave, about how like, for example, if AI and ML is something that you are selling as your core product, and Joe Reese also had a response on this too, right? It makes sense there potentially to build, because that is like a potential strategic element of your company or product. But in a lot of cases, like for example, where you're not sort of doing the moonshot AI ML product, that's like revolutionary, right? Like maybe you're just trying to like automate a bunch of processes, or you have some more like you're baking in AI, or as some people say, like AI native versus like AI inside, is another analogy. There it kind of just makes sense to buy. Now, how that's relevant to, for example, your employment, and your growth in your professional career as like a data scientist or an ML engineer. So I think, we started off with data science being like this bucket where like anyone could kind of like sort of fit in. You had this like wild west of skills and experiences. But what I'm seeing a lot more is that like, instead of having like strictly ML or AI practitioners, there's this kind of migration of people who are engineers, or people who are researchers, or people who are analysts developing like AI, ML, data science kind of capabilities, right? So it's adding on to kind of existing functions. And so here's the thing, right? Like if you want to continue growing your career, you will eventually kind of have to build up that skill set of being able to deploy stuff in production, because ultimately that's kind of what companies are paying for. They're kind of paying for, getting immediate business value. The companies where they, for example, like Google or Facebook scale, where they can kind of support, research teams, it might matter a little bit less. Like you can kind of just sort of specialize more. But for example, if your goal is to, number one, be employable, number two, make sure that your work actually has an impact. And also number three, like being able to sort of keep yourself open to sort of adjacent opportunities. It's really good to start like thinking about like, like hashtag MLOps, hashtag like machine learning engineering, hashtag whatever, right? There are certain skills or tools or platforms. It's good to get familiar with AWS just because they're kind of like leading the way in terms of companies being able to sort of like quickly kind of scale up those operations. You still kind of have to know sort of like what you're doing. And a lot of times, people who have like, for example, a software engineering background can kind of adopt into that a lot easier, right? Because they're essentially just going like, I have this sort of like paradigm for how, code should flow or code should work. And then they can just kind of map it to existing like AWS products or existing open source products. So I would definitely say like it's super important. There's like communities like MLOps and ML engineering that are just kind of growing around it because, it's something that I think lots of people are kind of facing that question of like, how do we move beyond the hype and actually just like really make it useful? So, I mean, that's like my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Mikiko. Yeah, absolutely love it. And I mean, just a quick, simple workflow to simulate model deployment, which I think would be good enough to talk about in a job interview, good enough to get you experience. You could have, maybe just you simulate a batched workflow that runs when you upload data. So data will come in somewhat unstructured. You get it cleaned, put it into a database, and you need to make predictions. Then you need to store predictions in maybe another relational database. So you could just create an AWS account, provision S3, RDS, EC2, use the free tier, then just create an automated process that's going to serve predictions whenever data is dropped into an S3 bucket, right? So you can write a Lambda function that gets triggered when an S3 object is dropped into the bucket. And then when there's, that new file comes in, kicks off a process, a series of scripts, using Lambdas. You'll have to figure out how to use they call it stacks, I think, in AWS. But yeah, file comes in, scripts kick off, do some transformations, then take that transformation, pass it to your model, have some predictions happen, push that back to a relational database, and whatever, the mini deployment. So let's hear from Mark on this, because Mark says he has coming from the perspective of someone making the transition now.
Yeah, so not gonna front as if I'm some expert. There's definitely much better experts in here, but I'm currently a data scientist who's trying to make the transition to ML engineering. And specifically about in August last year, I was laid off and gave me a chance to really think what I want for my career. It was like putting ML in production. And so especially for like the interview process, being very intentional, like where you're currently at and then where you want to go. So when I did my interviews, I said, hey, here's my skill set, here's where I want to add value, but I want to be an ML engineer eventually. How can I do more production code things? And that really tailored me to jobs that actually could provide that to me and provide those learnings. And then once I was in that role, and also what Harpreet said, that you can do your own kind of self-learning as well. But the thing that's been the most helpful in the past 6 months of my current role, where I'm learning how to write production level code, is code review. Just having people who are engineers actually review my code and say like, hey, here's this better way to do it. Or like, hey, I read their code and like, this is object-oriented programming. Please do this instead. It's been really helpful. And like my most recent project, I built an NLP pipeline. It was probably the hardest project I've ever done, but it's been the most growth I've ever had because I actually had an engineer basically mentor me a little bit in that role. And a big part of that was because in my job search, I specifically asked for that. And that was like one of the things I wouldn't kind of back down on.
We love that, Mark. Thank you so much. Any other tips or advice on this topic of, being able to have experience deploying models? The importance of it, I guess the importance of it can't be understated, but you can do a miniature version of it yourself and you can kind of understand the workflow and the pipeline. If you want to put it behind an API or whatever, that's up to you how complex you go, but there are so many resources out there that could, help you follow along. So better, the sooner you get that experience, I think the better. So definitely go.
I love that. I love that. If I could just throw in real quick, because you actually double dip, because you get A to Z. You actually did put something in production by doing a project, but you double dip because you got passion credit. And so sometimes if you're fighting for the MLOps position, you can't land that experience. If you have enough of these little projects, it speaks volumes. So definitely count your personal projects if you get them all the way to like inference API. Just, yeah.
Absolutely. So Mark, you're up next. So you got a question. Go for it.
Yeah, so something, I'm currently growing in my career, and something I noticed when I first started working in tech was I worked in operations, and a lot of the projects I did, or tasks essentially, was like if I did more work, I got more done, the outcome I got happened. And now I'm getting further in my data science career, the projects are much more complex, and more work does not equal better outcomes. I have to be much more intentional. And so I'm just curious, and this is probably a very subjective kind of response for everyone, but what strategies people use to like not burn out, because doing the sprint's not working anymore, but also like make better decisions as you're growing your career and doing more complex work.
I think the key to not burning out, the key to making better decisions is just having a certain stillness in your mind, right? I think that is probably the key to getting there. I know that's probably not the answer you're looking for, but for me to achieve that, I found that just journaling and writing my thoughts out every morning has been tremendously helpful. So I've got like 4 journals that I write in, right? One is just a complete brain dump where I just dump everything out of my head. And then another one is something that's more intentional, talking about how I'm going, what I'm planning on accomplishing today. Something along those lines. It's called the 6-minute journal. Highly recommend it. And I just find that to be helpful. It just helps me clear my head and clear my thoughts. And it just, there's less noise in my mind throughout the rest of the day when I do that. It's more still, it's more tranquil, and I'm just able to just do things. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but that's how I handle it. I guess I'd like to ask you, like, how do you define burnout? Do you define burnout as like, I hate data science, I can't do this anymore? Or what is your definition of burnout?
I use it as a broad term. I think burnout definitely means different things. I guess one of those, I hate data science, I can't do this anymore. But another one could just be like, I'm reaching the end of this project. I'm working on this project, but I'm not working as good as I was in the beginning of this project. And so, like, again, that was like if you approach a project with a sprint and not this marathon, it may work if it fits in that timeline, but if it exceeds that timeline, you're gonna be in trouble.
So I'd say maybe that you can reflect back on previous sprints, look at how much you were able to accomplish, and then kind of set a precedence, not a precedent, I don't know if that's the right word, but using what happened in previous sprints, right? If you can use that as a benchmark for how the next one is going to go, right? So then you could say, okay, well, I think we're overloading ourselves this time around because last time we tried to do this during a sprint, we had like 10 items left in the backlog and we didn't get a chance to get to them, right? So that's how I would do it. I'd love to hear from let's hear from Giovanna and then Ben on how you guys manage the burnout.
Thank you, Harpreet. I think that a good advice is to work based on priorities. I think it's the best thing because your energy, you have to focus your energy in the things that are going to make you grow as a professional. Everything is about what you want to achieve. So if you want to grow as a professional and you are learning more things in your position now, maybe you have to make more effort to achieve your goal, but you have to find what is the priority and put all your energy there and distribute. I think how you want to achieve the goal of your job and the goal that you have as a professional. I think you have to balance both of them because it's important that you need to grow in your position, but at the same time to grow as a professional, because I think you are not expected to stay all your life in that position or in that company. So you have to deal with that.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Ben, and after Ben, let's hear from Carlos, and then we'll hear from Jennifer and Pakiko. So just remember, you guys are in line.
I love this topic because I feel like colleges don't really prepare you for it, like mental health management. There you go get a job. And actually, I had the experience this year where I had a data scientist on the call, and he started crying. And it was one of those things where like you can break, like everyone on this call, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're not managing this, you can reach a breaking point that will shock you. And like he was fine. And then like within a few days, just completely broken. And then it's like, holy shit, like you haven't taken a vacation during all of COVID, like get your ass on a plane. And so he took a whole week off, went to some tropical islands with his family, and he's a different person now. So it's like, so I think the takeaway is, no one else knows you, and you should be in a constant discovery on how to manage your own mental health, whether it's exercise, meditation, everyone's different. And if you're at a breaking point, you need to manage your own mental health, and you can't expect someone else to do it for you because bosses get busy. They don't know what's going on in your head. So for me, getting outside, bike riding, there's lots of things that I do to help with that.
Thank you, Ben. Carlos, what about you?
I'm going to say something that I follow a lot of salespeople,
And sales is interesting because it's really like output oriented and not like input oriented, which is great. And one of the things I get in the newsletters is sharpen the saw. And I put in the chat what that means, but essentially like you're not really paid in data science to put 40 hours in on your coding. You're paid for like the outputs of your products. And so if that means you can do that in 25 hours at peak productivity, do that and spend the other 15 manipulating your life to have that perfect 25 hours consistently. So I mean, like exactly what Ben said, like get out, longboard, play basketball, do whatever you need to, and focus on like your output so that you're not like just sitting there, oh, I did my 40 and that's it. Because that's actually the worst situation. It's just like you do your 40 and you go home. That's really what they don't want from you. They want your excellence. And if you can do that sustainably at 25 hours of excellence, like that's awesome. Spend another 15 having fun. A lot of people do that. Oh, by the way, a lot of people are not working 40 hours a week. I don't know if people want to admit that, but I don't do 40 good hours most weeks.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Let's hear from Monica on this, and then Mikiko.
Yeah, so from a project perspective, I want to put a little twist on this, and some experiences that I've had in the past is you kind of look at a project as one chunk oftentimes, and you work to get that huge chunk done. And oftentimes when you get to the end and you present your product to the stakeholders, they're like, that wasn't quite what I was expecting. So my advice would be to kind of break it up into smaller milestones. And then at the end of each of those milestones, go back to the stakeholder and have that conversation with them to kind of check base if you're even moving in the right direction. And I think that's a good thing to have those breaks and that feedback to make sure that you're still going in the right direction and you're able to get motivated again in some instances where you're like, okay, you're doing a great job. This is what needs to happen next. So then you're re-energized and ready for the next milestone.
Absolutely love that. Thank you, Monica. Mikiko, how do you manage not burning out?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a little struggling with this a little bit right now. Some advice that people have given me is first off, think about kind of like the sum of your, I don't want to say the sum of your life's work, but like the sum of your life. So typically what happens, right, is like we get a queue of like stuff to do. And then we're like, okay, we'll try to like, fit in stuff into the calendar and kind of like just try to optimize it. But what I've seen other people do is like, for example, there's a professor that Cal Newport talks about. So what he did was he's like, okay, what I want to do is I want to spend 30% of my time doing research, 30% of my time with my family, and 40% of his time, I don't remember what. But essentially he said, he started off with the like, what does he kind of want his life to look like? Now, granted, it's a little bit different in academia. Time's a little bit more unstructured, but I do think you kind of want to start with intention. Simon Sinek, he has that book, Start With Why. That's pretty important because you'd be surprised like how many people just sort of like just auto drive their lives. And then you kind of see the result like in poor health or, professional goals or whatever, right? So it's start with that kind of intention first. Then like, so what I do is I waterfall method it, is I start with what is my intention. Then I kind of subtract out, okay, like literally how much do I have to do for work? I personally don't like doing 40 hours of work. It's just not going to happen. I'm like, if I can do like 20 hours, that'll be great. And then I'm like, okay, now how do I then sort of like do stuff around it, but then keep kind of pushing stuff into the buckets I do like. So that's one thing, is like starting with intention, right? Secondly, if it's a sprint, what I also like to do is I have these like imaginary envelopes where I have like a treat yourself kind of thing. Got that sort of from, community or no, Parks and Rec, right? Treat yourself. So I have treat yourself envelopes that I just like stack up. It's kind of like, just dollars, right? Every day you get a couple dollars in there or whatever points. You can also track in Habit RPG. Is a really nice one. I really like it. It reminds me back of my D&D and WoW days. But that's also a really good thing because the reality is that the more you sprint hard, kind of the more you need to rest. So that's another thing I do is I do up little envelopes where I'm like, this is my treat. This is my treat. And I just kind of like take out, right? So before quarantine, it was get a massage. Obviously, that's not happening at all. But it could be something like, for example, do digital painting. It could be design an outfit. That's like my side thing, is designing like a micro capsule brand. Just because I studied fashion design, right? So it's that's one other way to do it. It's always like treat yourself, right? It's like, are you like working to live or living to work? Yeah, those are my like sort of two things. It's like start with intention and then treat yourself envelopes.
I like that. I mean, like, there's been times last year when I was kind of feeling burnout right after, not only do I do the full-time job, mentorship with DJ, the podcast, some other side projects that I've got launching later this year. It gets hard, man. Like, there's some times where I'm just like, shit, man, like, what am I even doing? Like, do I still want to do all this stuff? I need to cut the axe on something. But um, I notice that happens when I just look at everything I have to do as like a giant mountain. When there's like so much shit, I'm just like overwhelmed by it, right? But I just start focusing on things that need to get done immediately, right? So what is the task that aligns most closely with whatever objective I'm trying to achieve, that's going to have the biggest payoff in, long-term, short-term, what have you. I guess somebody's talking about the Eisenhower Matrix here, and I think that's a great tool as well. Looking at what Dave said there in the chat, I think that's an interesting perspective as well. Dave, do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little out of place here. I'm not such a touchy-feely person by nature. So my basically, okay, when I was a manager and I was mentoring people in tech, I always told them it's a lifestyle choice, it's not a job. If you're going to be an applied STEM in business, you are going to be constantly investing in yourself to keep abreast of the latest developments, latest technologies, all the things that you need to do. You don't get to rest on your laurels. I used to work in an insurance company a long time ago, and I used to work with people that wrote COBOL for decades, and that's all they ever knew. And they all got decimated in the 2000s with globalization, right? So you have to be constantly investing in yourself. It's just part of the lifestyle. So the trick is to find something that you love. And as I put in the chat, at one point in time, I wanted to be an enterprise architect. That was my thing. And working at Microsoft broke me of that. So I said, you know what? I'm not doing that anymore. I'm getting out of that game. It's no fun anymore. I don't want to spend all of my time on it. And that's when I ended up getting into analytics full time. This was, I don't know, 10 years ago now. So that hasn't changed. Once I got into analytics, it was I did my work, and on nights and weekends, I was studying and learning new things, developing new skills, but I loved it, so it didn't seem like work. So it might seem a bit negative, a bit pessimistic, but I don't think of it that way. I just think of it as that's the reality of working in applied STEM in business, and I just find something that I love to do and do it. That's what I do.
I love it, Dave. Thank you. John Sebastian, I'm curious, like, what's like so John Sebastian is a neuroscientist. I'm wondering what is like the neuroscience behind burnout?
Well, that was not my main field of study, but just to connect pretty much everything that was previously said, I think that Monica raised a good point, and then Mikiko adds some more good points. And I think even Dave, without noticing it, kind of linked the entire thing together. So when it comes down to, dealing with complexity, because, that was the original question, uh, complexity usually most of the time is just like the sum of small tasks. And if you're able to, and again, I'm just going to relate to what Monica was saying, if the idea is for you to be able to break down this big task into smaller tasks so that you can actually, just take the whole thing in bite size. So that way you can actually see the end goal, and you can actually, and then this is where I connect with what Mikiko was saying. So then every time you finish a small task, you can actually reward yourself, because ultimately this is how we work. We have a task to do, but it needs to lead to something in which we're going to get some sort of reward. That's the neuroscience thing, but that's also just a human thing. So if you can actually finish a small task, getting yourself a reward, and then move on to the next thing. And I think this is basically how it connects to what Dave was saying, is that ultimately, if you like doing something, of course, there's always like the debate, um, should you go with your passion, or should you work into doing something to see if you're going to be passionate? So, but I don't want to get into that that debate. The whole idea is for you, whenever you actually start doing something and you like it, of course it will not look as work anymore, but it would still be stressful. But stressful is not evil. We always describe stress as being something that is negative, but it's just something that's happening in your body. And basically, stress, it's also what drives you whenever you're doing something that you're passionate about. So it's something that is actually good, that could actually be good as well. So you just need to realize that. And once you realize that, your whole mindset will shift with it. But it's a process, and you need to be conscious about it. So whenever you're facing complexity, it's just think of it as just being like a collection of small tasks, and just break it down so that you'll be able to see the end.
Thank you very much, John Sebastian. Mikiko also said Diffuse Learning by Barbara Oakley. I think that's great. By the way, keep an eye out for the episode I did with Barbara Oakley that will be launching sometime in the near future. Also, a couple of books from authors that are going to be on the show a little bit later that I recommend when it comes to tackling big problems. One is called Cracking Complexity by David Benjamin. That book is friggin' amazing. I'm really excited to be able to speak to him about that. And then the book, the interview I'm releasing next Friday with Fred Pellard is called How to Be Strategic, and that's the book of the same name as well. I highly recommend both of those for how to break down and solve big challenges. Lots of great advice there in the chat as well. So hopefully you got what you needed, Mark.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. I mean, my original question was around complexity, but the shift to burnout was actually a much better conversation. So I really appreciate everyone's comments, and it is so helpful.
All right, I guess I must have heard the question wrong or read it wrong when it was on my screen, but looks like you got both both things covered. All right, cool. Let's go to Carlos. Carlos, you've got a couple of questions, one about blockchain and then one about CoderPad. Go for it.
Let's get the blockchain one. So I'm going to broaden this one a little bit. So I'm doing an interview for a large tech company, my second large tech company interview, and it's going to be live CoderPad. It's going to be SQL and R and all this stuff. But CoderPad is like no autocomplete. Implication is I'm not supposed to look up documentation and stuff like that involving live coding.
So you cracked off there towards the tail end of your question. I'm not sure if Carlos has audio working right now. Yeah, I can't hear you right now. But let's see if we can get him some feedback. Has anybody here taken a CoderPad interview? If you have, just go ahead and talk about it. John, I see your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've done one for Spotify, and I've also done one for Facebook. And to be honest, usually like with Spotify, they were quite friendly with it. I got to choose the language that I was coding in, and they were quite happy with pseudocode actually. So it was kind of more to test like how to, I don't know, like program a task efficiently, rather than you remembering and recalling all the syntax, because I don't think anybody really does. I think you always kind of find yourself referring to Google or, to documentation. So yeah, that's my experience of it.
Anybody else done CoderPad or anything similar to that could help Carlos out with some insight? Doesn't look like it.
Sorry, can you hear me now? The question was just like any experience with like the big tech company interviews that involve live coding and like how your experience doing that. Because there's no IDE, no autocomplete, no documentation, no Googling. So it's like very interesting.
Yeah, I've never been in that situation. Akshay, you said you've done some leak code. Is that anything similar to CoderPad?
It's more of like sample code. So you get a lot of interview questions from big companies, and it's a little bit guided, I would say. It's not completely blank slate, but that's something I found useful in the past.
All right, there you go. I think in general with these type of, like in that scenario, kind of along the lines of what John was talking about, it's more just your thought process and the way you're thinking through the problem that you're working on. So I think if you can just communicate and make it kind of two-way communication with them and just talk about what you're doing out loud, that could go a long way.
I just posted a link in the chat, but there's this resource called Interview Query, and they have an excellent blog where they talk about how to approach doing technical interview questions for a lot of the FANG folks. And what I really like about his resource is that it's not just like, hey, here's how you do it, how code XYZ, but it gives you strategies of like how to talk to the interviewer, what type of questions should you ask the interviewer, how should you approach it. I wish I had it when I was interviewing earlier for FANG.
Yeah, this looks awesome. Check that out, guys. Interviewquery.com. I'll be sure to post a link to that in the show notes as well. So yeah,
I'd just like to add as well, like I think with the CoderPad stuff, it's just important to remain relaxed as well, because ultimately you can prepare, but there's always going to be a curveball. Like, you know, you can't predict everything that's going to come up. So yeah, a lot of it is about talking through your thought process. So for example, with the Spotify one, it was quite simple and I got it straight away. And, you know, there was several stages to it, where they asked you to initially build some kind of loop and then kind of make it more efficient. And fortunately for me, it was something that I had a lot of practice with, so I got it straight away. But then when I had the Facebook one, it was more of an SQL type problem with their kind of specific chat databases, and it took me a while to get my head around what was actually happening with the data, and it required me to ask a lot of questions to clarify things. So it's important to just relax and make sure that you're clarifying what the problem actually is that needs to be solved. Communicate with the interviewer as well, and you should be fine.
Absolutely wonderful advice, John. Thank you very much. Anybody else have anything to say on this topic?
Well, actually, I forgot about it, but I did have one maybe a year ago. And just the way it went was very similar to what John was saying. And I still remember what was the actual task. And actually, I use that task when it comes down to, you know, making demo for people. So I was sitting with the interviewer, and basically she asked me to build an average streamer. And basically what it was is that to be able to design classes in which you would feed a number one at a time, and you just generate the average, and you just keep track of everything what's happening, keep track of the sum and the count and so on. And yeah, and I think that so the way it went is that she basically described the entire problem, and then I started coding a little bit. And as I was coding, she would specify some new rules that we need to follow. So, you know, like just make sure that what would happen if you were to consider like a character as opposed to a number. So could you add like a function that would take care of this within the class? And yeah, so actually it was more than a year ago. It was 2 years ago. I remember that I failed the interview, but yeah, it was a learning experience, because at that time I was not all too familiar with object-oriented programming. And yeah, basically after that interview, I learned pretty much everything about OOP. But yeah, this is how it went for me. And yeah, and sorry, and yes, just, you know, be cool, be relaxed, be sure to ask questions, because they're not there to nail you. They're there to still help you out, because, you know, in reality, when you're going to work like with colleagues, I mean, no one will expect you to, well, sort of, but no one will expect you to be able to do everything on your own. So you'll be working in teams. So yeah, you should be fine if you communicate with the interviewer.
And I think an important thing to keep in mind is just by preparing for these types of scenarios, these types of interviews, you yourself will become a better data scientist, right? You'll learn a lot, you'll gain skills just by having to prepare for this. So if you go into this with the mindset that, you know, win or lose, I'm still coming out on top because I've learned something and I've become better than I was last week. I think that could help alleviate some stress or some burden from that respect. That's one thing I would add to that. So next up is John. John, go for it. And then after John, we got a typed question here from a audience member. And if anybody else has a question, go ahead and type it into the chat or just say you have a question so that I can add you to the queue. John, go for it.
Yeah, I go. So in the UK, often the data science process, like for getting a job as a data scientist, is quite long-winded, and a significant part of that process is a take-home task. And I found I've done quite a lot of these take-home tasks, and usually they say you should spend between 4 to 6 hours on it. So for example, I had a take-home task for Spotify that they gave me a 7-day time frame to do it, but ideally it should take you between 4 to 6 hours. And you know, I've had similar tasks for other smaller kind of tech companies. So my question is around how others approach these. I've done probably about 4 or 5 of these now, and now I'm thinking pretty much I'm just going to build a standardized kind of pipeline to deal with these things, because I don't really have the time to be spending like 6-7 hours on it anymore. It's usually, just to give you some idea about what the tasks are, it's usually some kind of machine learning problem. So it could be like a classification or a regression problem. So does anyone else have like any tips on how to approach take-home tasks, and could you share like what's worked for you in the past?
I think that's a excellent starting point for what you said. Just kind of have a templated way about going through this, because you're developing a set of principles that you're then going to transfer over to work. So I think that for sure is a great way to go about that. I'd love to hear from let's hear from Joe with Bernie in the background about how to handle take-home assignments.
Man, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask for this, honestly. So I haven't interviewed in ages, and I'm probably the world's worst interviewer when I have to. So I'm going to pass the question on to somebody else, unfortunately.
No problem. So let's hear from Dave. Dave or Tom.
Unfortunately, I'm in Joe's position as well. I'm old, so I don't really interview like that anymore.
All right. So I mean,
I have a fun story. So before there was even anything called data science, I was going through the Naval Nuclear program, and I wasn't an instant, but I went through the same training and all of that. It was a very rigorous program, and I was going up for this certification. I was in this, it's a rigorous interview with 3 experts. And very early on in this rigorous review board, I thought I had missed a question, totally bombed it, totally failed. And I was known as the nervous guy in any of these reviews. And I just totally relaxed because I thought, oh, I failed. I'll just, be polite and answer the questions. So I was just totally at ease. And my manager came out of the board and he said, Tom, they said they've never seen you more relaxed. And that was the best answers they've ever gotten from anyone. And it was like this, I still suck at not getting nervous in certain situations, but I'm just saying, I think I learned this from Giovanna too. She said it in one of our Saturday morning sessions about the importance of staying relaxed in the interview. And I'm like Dave and Carlos, I haven't done a lot of interviews later in my career, but I'm the worst at getting nervous in a technical interview. And if you can force yourself to stay relaxed, that's huge. But to the answer to these take-home evaluations, I cannot overstress really getting good at learning the machine learning pipeline. And if y'all would like, I'll try to dig up, I've got a link I could put in the chat for anyone that wants to review that. it's just a good way to organize your thoughts anytime you approach any machine learning project. I'll just put it in the chat and go back on mute.
Yeah, so
I guess maybe as a hiring manager, I can answer this question, having given take-home tests and assignments. Like if I were to issue a take-home assignment, I would expect back something that is maybe the simplest way to solve a problem. So don't try and like over-impress the company with how complicated you can make stuff. I would say try and reduce the problem down to something that's really simple, clean code. Definitely abide by coding standards. If you're using Python, use PEP8. I pay really close attention if you're using bad syntax in Python. Like if you violate PEP8 too many times, I'll just disqualify you out of hand. So, because I think a coding interview and technical interview is as much of you showing how you can demonstrate knowledge as much as you can communicate in the style that's been presented to you. So, and maybe clear documentation or comments are necessary as well. It's sort of if you like gave a pull request to a project, it would be very similar standards, I would say. So, but that's me.
So I'll give some general advice. So, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, John Sebastian and Mikiko, because we've done like literally hundreds of these for Data Science Dream Job. So like I literally have this week, I've probably done like 7 or 8 like assistings with take home assignments, just because that's what we do during the office hours there. But without knowing too many details about your specific problem statement, I'll outline a few core things that you should make sure. Right. First of all, just make sure that you have a well-organized repository structure with a clear entry point and a clear exit point. Right. Make sure your top level README file does a good job of talking about the problem statement, talking about what your approach is, and then, walking us through kind of how you're going about the project. Right. Make sure that you're making good use of, like Joe said, PEP8 standards. Again, this is all depends on what your specific case is, but make sure you have good use of OOP principles. Make sure if you're doing graphs that you've got a title to the graph, you've got your X and Y axes labeled. Like that's super important. If you've got a notebook or a series of notebooks, make sure if you have a series of notebooks that it's very clear where we start from and what the progression is, right? So that could be as simple as saying 00 dash enter here, 01 dash EDA, 02 dash feature engineering, 03 dash whatever, right? And make sure it's clear and make copious use of comments, right? So make sure your doc strings for your functions are really up to par, well defined, right? What goes into this function, what comes out, right? Make sure that you're walking us through your thought process, because like I can't open your head and look into it and say, what was this guy thinking when he did this thing, right? So definitely walk us through what is going on in your mind when you're doing this, right? And additionally, like you don't need to include like all your heads, info. You don't need to have like, don't make the notebooks something where I have to sit there and scroll for like 45 cells before I get to something interesting, right? If there's shit that's like not interesting to you and you're just putting it there just to show that you know how to do it, I'd probably remove that, right? Because the point is you want whoever's reviewing this, make their lives easy, right? If I've got 150 people applying for the same job and I have to scroll more than like 10 cells before I get to something interesting, I got no time in my day, man. I got to move on. So I will gladly toss your project in the trash and just say, sorry. And then give you no feedback because you made my life difficult. So those are some key general points. John Sebastian, Mikiko, what do you guys think?
Yeah, definitely agree with you. I think maybe one more thing that I could add is probably to, so focus on the problem you're trying to solve. And we see this too often. People who are actually either generating like a model or even just answering data analysis problems that are not actually answering the actual question that was asked. That happens all the time. Well, quite often. And one more thing that I would say is try to connect the problem you're solving with the business with a business problem, that you're trying to solve. Meaning, if you're generating a model, I mean, it's good if you report me the metric at the end, but tell me what the metric will do, how it's going to bring business value. So if you tell me that, hey, you know, I'm going to have like a 90% accuracy, it's like, good for you. But ultimately, you know, what was the problem about? Was it, were you trying to do like a marketing ad campaign problem, or were you trying to optimize like a sell process? If so, try to explain to me how this metric is going to affect the sales, and try to come up, even if you just make up numbers, try to put value to the end result, and try to put it into $ value.
Thank you very much, Jean-Sebastian. Mikiko, I know you dropped some excellent resources in the link as well. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, totally. So from a, I guess, hacks standpoint, first thing is definitely start building up your like repository of functions that you use. You can just store them in GitHub, right, as like gists, and you can also look at other people's gists too. Second thing is, in general, you can't go wrong with a notebook, either in R or Python, or like a Jupyter notebook, or like sorry, I don't know what the R equivalent is. Everyone can, you know, yell at me in the chat, but notebooks are really great because that's the whole point, is they're for collaboration and communication. As development tools, they're kind of shite, but you know, for communication, they're great. Secondly, like you can have a template, like notebook style. So for me, I have a template one I use where I just have things like stubbed out for myself, right? Not every problem is going to be the same, but it just kind of helps to like cut down on time, which is really nice. Third thing I would say is if you don't prefer notebooks, definitely get used to like shortcuts, or, you know, for example, I like to use VS Code. So I have some shortcuts there. Is really nice. Another place I really like to look is Kaggle notebooks for competitions. I would go to Kaggle notebooks, sort by the, you know, like the most upvoted, and you can get some really good examples of analyses there. And then I'd say the Kaggle notebooks, I talked about that. I dropped some links, you know, for example, like one is a walkthrough for a production data science notebook. And I also dropped a link to a series of like student capstones from Springboard. They're not necessarily all like the most amazing, and they were also developed over like a period of, you know, 6 months, but that can be maybe some inspiration, and you might find some functions that you can just kind of bookmark. But that's pretty much what it comes down to. And then last but not least, for example, for Python, there's like 3 libraries that are used a lot, right? It's like scikit-learn, Seaborn, and then, you know, I forgot, there's like a third one, no, maybe NumPy, right?
Pandas?
Pandas, yeah, shoot, I know, that's so bad. I was just writing some code too. I'm sorry, I'm only on my second cup of coffee. So the documentation for those is great. If you go to like the demos or the gallery stuff, I also will just save off stuff too. All these things I just like organize and save as links or like code pieces in like my GitHub or Notion. And that's just kind of like the way to kind of sort of hack it, because I don't think you don't really want to be spending time on like the code or the setup or the cleanliness. Those are kind of things you should sort of have going. You want to spend a little bit more time on like so for example, if you're going more for a data analyst or scientist role, on like the insight, some interesting trends, even some recommendations. And if you're going for more of an engineering role, probably what you want to spend more time on is displaying like kind of best practices, you know, like for example, like CI/CD or, you know, unit testing and all that stuff. Yeah, that's my bullet point list of hacks.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Anything else to add on this from anyone? Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in. Also, shout out to Al Bellamy. I just noticed that you're here. How's it going, man? Good to see you here. Monica, anything to add about take-home assignments and tips on how to do them properly?
I don't think I have anything necessarily to add. Everyone had really good points. I really like the idea of having a pipeline so that things can go faster every time you're working on it. A huge emphasis on solving the problem that they give you. That's where you're really going to wow the interviewers, is if you solve that problem, because that's what the whole point of it is solving problems, and not wowing them in other ways. Like a while back, I was taking one of those take-home tests and thought it would be really cool to have my graphs in the color scheme of the company. I thought they'd be like, oh, she gets us, she understands. And no, it didn't really work very well. But so wow them by answering their business questions.
Yeah, make it easy for the person on the other end reviewing it to see that you can easily come in and contribute value. So that's the whole objective with the take home assignment, right? So
Harpreet, real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
EDX, the free version of Microsoft's data science certification coursework, they have an excellent series on storytelling. And then Power BI, which is essentially Tableau or Google Data Studio. But I just think those are really good things to go through.
Thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate that. So, John, hopefully that you got some takeaways there. Let me know if you got any other questions. Otherwise, we can go to the next question.
Oh, thanks. That was really good, everyone. Yeah, very useful insights there. So thank you.
Right on. So another question that came in through the chat. This one is from Mitul, and he's asking, he's got some background issues with background noise, so he can't unmute, but he's saying, how do you get around an issue where companies want to give their first preference to computer science, ML/stats backgrounds in terms of hiring? Having done interviews at 20 or so companies in the past, I've noticed this trend, and it's kind of sad for fresh grads who are coming from diverse backgrounds to break into the DS field. So Mitul, if I'm not mistaken, I think you're working on your PhD in physics, which I think is a great setup for data science. And I mean, even look around this room, man, like a lot of us don't necessarily come from computer science or ML stats background. So I'd love, I mean, Mikiko, if you could link to your post on Medium about your journey to data science, I think that'll be amazing, because her background is not computer science or anything like that at all. She studied anthropology and was still able to do
I
this.
studied monkeys throwing poop at each other during midterms. David Attenborough was great. I entered college, biomedical engineering pre-med, exited out, monkeys, CrossFit.
So I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to chime in here about, you know, how first of all, I would say this. First of all, how big is your sample size of companies that you're looking at, right? So have you looked at 1,000 companies, and all, you know, a significant portion of these 1,000 are asking for computer science or ML? Or, you know, if you do come from a physics background like yourself, which is extremely quantitatively rigorous, but do you have projects, specific data science projects, to showcase your ability to do work, right? So that's one way to kind of bridge the gap. Tom, let's hear from you here.
Just real quick, did you say he's getting his PhD in physics?
Yeah, I think Matul is working on.
I just wanted to jump in there. So I did my master's in theoretical physics, and I did some projects, like personal projects in data science, when I was trying to transition into the data science field. But like doing interviews at companies, I've seen that even if you do some personal projects in data science, they still want people from computer science background or machine learning and stats. And this is not just me, but I have friends who've done like PhD and masters in physics. And, you know, even now after a year, they're still trying to find a job in the field, and they're just getting rejected because of this. So like, so my question.
Let me give you, I'll give you my experience real quick. So migrated into data science as a PhD in industry, and didn't have a data science title for a long time. worked on some ways to kind of fix that. But what I found, the tool, is that I was very marketable to people or companies that were more aligned to my engineering background and still needed a data scientist. And I just stopped fighting it and found that, oh, I still love this. I love this part of the industry, and I get to be more data science centric, serving that industry. So I would just encourage you to be very open to places that are doing, that need someone with a physicist's mind and a data science emphasis. You might find that you are the unicorn candidate to them. Just maybe just apply more to those kind of areas like national labs, et cetera. You know, R&D companies or R&D departments. Just a thought, though.
And in terms of, you know, like physics, like I wish you were here last week when Shantana was joining us. So Shantana, she's got her PhD in like physics as well, and she was working at CERN for the longest time, like at the Hadron Collider, looking for like this thing called the Upsilon particle. And now she's a machine learning engineer in industry, and she was having a great conversation with somebody here. I don't know if she's here today, with Megan, about how somebody from an academic background can break into data science. So I highly recommend going. I'll link you to the video from last week, and I think you can find some great tips and insights there. But I would say you can probably bridge the gap not only with personal projects, but just making sure that your interview game is on point, right? So making sure that you're communicating properly during the interview, making sure that you understand the company, that, you know, all these other types of quote unquote non-technical skills that are important for data science, make sure that you're capitalizing on those. But I will link you to the discussion from last week. I think you can really benefit from that, because this is straight up somebody who studied physics that has made this transition. I'll try to put you guys in touch as well. Anybody else have something to add to this? John, yeah, Dave.
So it's not directly related, but set the Wayback Machine to the 90s. When I was first getting started, my bachelor's degree is in economics, and I wanted to be a software engineer. And back then, if you didn't have a computer science degree, you were unlikely to get a software engineering job. So to echo kind of what Tom was saying, don't be afraid to be broad in terms of getting a job anywhere. So my first coding job was programming COBOL on a mainframe. That's not what I wanted to do. Despite what Joe might tell you, that's not what I wanted to do. But I took the job because it was a foot in the door. And that's usually what you need. You just need that first job, that first title, and that gets the ball rolling. And sometimes it might not necessarily be the perfect job, but just see it as one step along the journey. And that's going to be critical, because the company that paid me to be a COBOL programmer also trained me to be a COBOL programmer. And I only did it for 9 months. Once they found out I knew C++, they had me do that instead. That's actually what I wanted to do. So it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been willing to do the COBOL job first.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dave. So anybody else want to add anything to this topic? I think it's a great topic, but it was something that we covered really in depth last week. I'll be sure to link you to it, Matul. Some great insights there. But if nobody else has anything to add, let's
Can I
move
throw
on.
something in real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, I have a kind of non-traditional, or we'll call it eclectic background. And I've had a couple of conversations with people just because they actually were interested in somebody who didn't have that traditional background, but I didn't get to them to talk to them because I applied, because I threw my resume into a black hole ATS hoping for the best. I had those conversations, one, because the one person reached out to me after just seeing something that I had shared that I worked on. And another one, I saw that they had posted that they were hiring and interested in talking to people. And both of those conversations were great and have led to like just open conversations that we're having, you know, moving forward that could eventually turn into jobs. And so, but neither of them happened because there was a job posting that I applied for and then got to a conversation. So I think that sometimes just starting the real conversations with real people, then they can see you as the context that in your context and how you might fit into their world as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Eric.
I just want to add that it's very important, it's an advantage to know about the industry. Sometimes if you have a background in that industry and you want to jump into data science and you know about that industry, they take you in consideration because you know about the business and you can be trained. And for example, here in Italy, there are a lot of position that they said, okay, if you know about the industry, that is a plus. So I think it's something interesting.
That's a very, very good point. Monica, go for it.
Oh, never mind.
And then Monica, then we'll hear from Mark.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say like data is literally everywhere. So I have an accounting background. I got my first job as an IT information security auditor. So sometimes you just have to be creative, know what data exists in your area and what you can do with that data. And then maybe create a personal project off of that and show what you can do with data that exists in your world.
Yeah, that's an excellent point because you're dealing with a lot of the same issues in physics that people are dealing with in industry, right? So a classic example is for fraud detection, right? Fraud detection, you might have the issue of having a imbalanced classification problem where the fraud cases are very, very low compared to normal cases. Well, in physics, you're dealing with something similar, but it's the opposite scenario, right? Where you have too much noise and the thing that you're interested in is not as frequent in the data set. It's the same, like you draw those analogs between the type of problems that you're working on in physics to the type of problems that people will be working on in industry, right? Like a classic example I always use from biostatistics days is survival analysis. We did survival analysis when I was an actuary, and we did it as a biostatistician. And it turns out in industry, when you have subscribers, it's called churn. So try to find those correlations, those analogs between the types of problems you work on in physics and what is happening in industry. So let's hear from Mark. By the way, Greg, what's up? Good to see you here.
I just want to share a recent thing my friend did that I was really impressed by. Just to change your perspective, is like not necessarily finding opportunities, but creating opportunities. So he got burnt out of one of his last job and just quit and said, I'm just going to spend some time finding a new job. He went and got a subscription to PitchBook, which is like a website for startups for funding. He went and did a data-driven approach. He found all startups that were Series D in funding between the sizes of 60 and 80 people in healthcare. Then when he got that list, he did a deep dive search of all the news press releases to figure out what their pain points were. And then he developed stories for his top 10 choices of like, if he was there, what problems he would fix with his skill set. And then he went directly on LinkedIn and emailed to the CEOs or different hiring managers and said, hey, I'm so-and-so. I noticed that you're in this position based on these press releases. I can do XYZ for you. He literally had multiple companies say, we don't have a position for you, but let's interview. And one company actually created a position for him. So if you're finding a hard time finding a position, just like create one, just being very strategic and taking a very data-driven approach.
There you go, man. Choose yourself. Sounds like that guy read Choose Yourself by James Altucher, because that's exactly the type of thing he would have done. Awesome. So Matul, hopefully that was helpful. I will link you to the conversation from last week, which I think will be highly relevant to you. Next up, we're going to go to Akshay, and then after Akshay, we got Jacqueline. So Akshay, are you still here? Did you leave?
Yeah, so my question was around decorators as functions in Python. I've been learning that lately and just kind of struggling with the whole approach of writing wrapper classes and passing arguments to that within the decorated functions. So wanted to know if anyone has any tips around how we can best get on this object-oriented programming here.
Joe?
I would ask, like, what are you planning to use a decorator for?
It's not for a project. I'm just learning right now. So I've been familiar with functions before because I've been writing that in different languages, but this is something new for me as a decorator, and I'm just struggling how it's used in an actual software programming approach.
You'll see it used quite a bit, I think, to consolidate code. I think the trick is the decorator itself, the wrapper class needs to be correctly defined for other people who are looking at the code base. Because otherwise you can get into like decorator hell pretty easy, where it's just like decorator. And it's like pretty soon you're just gone bonkers. I would say definitely learn the design patterns of decorators and how to write them and how they work. And then I would suppose if you're working on a team where decorators are used quite a bit, then you'll be equipped to understand how that works. But I would say as a general practice, unless there's a reason to, I personally try and stay away from decorators in Python. But Matt, do you have any thoughts on decorators or any opinions?
Hold on, sorry, just unmuting. I mean, my sense is more that these show up in really complex libraries and projects than anything else. And so, I don't know, maybe other people have other opinions, but unless you're developing a really complex internal framework, it seems like they're not quite as common, but maybe you guys can cite some counterexamples to that.
I would say you might want to focus more on context managers. Decorators, they have their place, but the only, mostly it's been in web frameworks that I find them real valuable, like in Flask. Context managers are not so hard to understand and write, and I wouldn't say that it's super hard to learn decorators, but I agree with Joe and Matt. It's rare that you really need to write one of those, but if you do, just be insistent in your Google searches. There was one day I just was tired of it and I wanted to understand decorators better. And I finally found a really good blog post that it wasn't a toy blog post. It really went through the details of how they were, gave great analogies. I don't think I even saved it, but if you're just really understanding decorators in Python and then study multiple links till you really get it. But I think you might walk away saying, yeah, Joe and Matt were right. I probably want a context manager or something like that instead.
In fact, what would be a good, I mean, I would look at some open source code for some existing web frameworks. That's probably where I'd start. And
I came across a lot of decorators in the Django framework because I was having to like go into the inner guts of that thing for a long time. So I mean, I got really well versed in their use, but I think it's just, a lot of it depends on the team that you're working with too, and the coding style they adopt. But I mean, decorators definitely have their place, but I think it's good to know when you come across them and when to use them.
So if I could just go ahead and jump in, Akshay. Decorators are an old school design pattern, and they're not necessarily Python specific. Python has them. So if you're interested in actually understanding the object-oriented why of decorators, grab like the Gang of Four, the design patterns book, the original design patterns book. It talks a lot about decorators and the why they exist.
Okay, that's definitely helpful. Thank you.
Anybody else have anything to add on decorators? Only thing I know about decorating is Christmas trees.
I was about to make a joke about that, but it would have been too easy.
All right. So next question up we got is Jacqueline. Go for it.
Hi, everyone. So I would like to have a bit of feedback on a career plan I have right now. So my goal is to be a data scientist, but I've also been considering some positions that are more like in the business side of it. So specifically business intelligence developer positions. So my idea behind it is that I would get to know a bit the business perspective, and also it would give me time to build some projects on my own that have more technical. Yeah, I know it came up last week. I was watching the recording of the office hours, but there's this fear of getting stuck in a position or like, so yeah, I wanted to know your feedback on my plan. Like, what would you do to not get classified as a non-technical position? What would you do to improve it? Yeah.
I think the plan sounds pretty good, especially if it's something that you're interested in, and a way to not, avoid that classification of a non-technical person is just do your work technically as possible. Like you can still use the tools of the trade, I think, and accomplish what it is you're trying to accomplish with the business. But I'd love to hear from, let's hear from Greg from on this topic.
Yes. So Jacqueline, you know, if I understand well, are you're currently working with business teams in your current space?
I'm not working yet, so I'm applying to jobs, and it would be in a business set. Yeah.
Okay, so I would say, you know, make sure you have a list of problems that you want to solve, and then as Harpreet said, solve them the most technical way possible. And for that, you have to have some benchmark of how technical teams solve these issues, and try to solve them the same way. And then make sure you have a solid storytelling behind it as well. So whether it's written and verbal communication, practice on that, because regardless you're technical or not, you will need to be able to close that bridge, that gap. Business teams often say is that when you're too technical, I don't understand what you've done to solve the issue. So again, you know, be technical as possible, but also be a great storyteller, so you can be sure to win on both sides.
Great, thank you. Any advice on improving a storytelling, your quality?
That's a great question. You don't really see that unless you guys know any. So there's Kate's storytelling course. Somebody said here. I guess it comes with practice, really, right? So industry knowledge also helps, right? When you have a handle on the industry, what you're solving, why you're solving it, it becomes easy to explain what you do on the how to solve it kind of thing. So take some time to deep dive the industry itself, so you can have a deep understanding on what the issue you're trying to solve, and that to me really helps with storytelling. And write, right? So write and ask people to read it. People who are outside of your space, and ask them for feedback. And so they will tell you whether you're clear or not with your storytelling.
Thanks, Greg.
Love to hear from Makiko on this topic.
So one book I might recommend is Making Ideas Stick. So I don't remember which brother it's from, whether it's Chip or Dan Heath.
Both of them made to stick.
Yeah, Made to Stick. But they actually had like between the two of them, they have like a series of these sort of like pop communication books. But they're really kind of nice. And like one of the things I sort of took away from the Made to Stick idea was to, instead of, sometimes like it's good to start with like a little vignette, you know, like in order to sort of like contextualize or centralize people to the problem, instead of just coming out and saying like, okay, like this is a problem. It's like have a little sort of vignette, then you follow up with the problem. And then with another book, there's like the Minto principle. I think it's like the Blue Pyramid book. But if you look up Minto too, like she also talks about like what's a really good way to sort of like structure your communication and analysis, including like the rule of three, which is, you have a point and then you structure with like 3 pillars. Yeah. One thing I will say though, like it is, so we had the saying at this one company, which really should have been a signal to me to leave that company sooner, but whatever, was be careful what you're good at. So there's kind of like in a company sometimes, if you get really good at certain things, for example, like really quick short analyses or all that jazz, sometimes they'll sort of like kind of keep giving you that work, so it's kind of good to be able to recognize kind of when things are just sort of like simple explorations that you can just kind of push aside, be able to triage those really quickly, and then you can move on to the projects that require a little bit more sort of technical sort of depth and insight.
Let's hear from Giovanna and Dave on this, on Jacqueline's career path and plan that she's pursuing.
Okay. I was typing on the chat. Yeah, it's like don't say that you don't have a technical background. Focus on your projects and the things that you are able to do, and show the projects and the experience that you have gained doing them. So don't put in their minds the label that non-technical. So show what you are able to do, and if you know you can get some information about that company. Maybe you have some contact on LinkedIn that work there, and maybe to know what are the issues that they are dealing with. Maybe you can go with some ideas to solve a problem, and you can talk with them about that. And that is a great way of make you like a spotlight yourself to make them feel that you are the person that they want in their team. So it could be a good idea.
Dave?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the chat, if your goal, and I'm making a presumption here, so forgive me if it's wrong. If your goal is to eventually become an analytics professional of some form, where analytics is what you do all day, be careful about business intelligence, because business intelligence is its own career path. It's its own thing. It's a very worthwhile path. It can be quite lucrative, by the way, as well, but it's not necessarily a purely analytical type of position. For example, you can spend many years building assets, analytical assets for companies. You can become an expert, for example, in the SQL Server stack for Microsoft, build cubes and reports and data warehouses and all kinds of stuff. And that's all good and valuable to the companies that you build it for, but you don't do analyses. You're not doing analytics. So if you're going to look at a business intelligence position, I would advise being very, very deliberate in talking to the hiring manager regarding what the responsibilities are actually going to be. Because you can be extremely technical as a business intelligence professional, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're actually doing analyses. You might be writing SQL, you might be writing DAX, you might be building things, but you're not necessarily doing analytics. So just be careful if that is your goal, is to be an analyst at some point.
Excellent advice, Dave. Thank you very much for that. Jacqueline?
No, thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Awesome. Last call for questions. If anybody has a question, go ahead and just type it into the chat. I am also super excited to announce that starting February 7th, I will be hosting an additional office hour session every Sunday at 11 a.m. I think this will be much more friendlier for our friends in the EU and in Europe in general. I'm partnering with Comet ML. We're going to be hosting the Comet ML Data Science Office Hours powered by the Artists of Data Science. I'm extremely happy to have this support for the show. I hope you guys will be joining me for those sessions as well, because I know they'll be just as awesome as these sessions.
11 a.m. What time zone, Harpreet?
Central time.
Okay.
Yeah, so within the next week or so, we'll get the infrastructure set up so you guys can all register for that. It'll be a different room than this room. It'll be a room hosted on their own Zoom account. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. All right, so I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I hope you guys got an opportunity to check out the interview I did today with Christian Bush. It was one of my favorite books that I read last year, The Serendipity Mindset. It was absolutely amazing. I enjoyed the conversation I had with him. Next week, I've got an interview releasing with Fred Pellard. His book is called How to Be Strategic. Also an amazing book. I mean, I still can't believe that I interviewed freaking James Altucher earlier this week. To me, that was just mind-boggling.
That guy's a hoot.
Yeah, he's awesome, man. I love him. I'm a big fan of all his work, and yeah, so that was exciting for me to interview him. Doesn't look like there's any more questions in the chat, guys. Thank you for hanging around. Take care. We'll see you next week. Until then, remember, you got one life on this planet. Why not try to do something big? Cheers, everybody.